first and foremost, this budget is really just a continuation of that IMF program that was started by former President Ranil Wickremesinghe in 2022. There's really nothing more to this budget in that sense. And that, I think is very much a recognition that the program that was started back in 2022 is one that is widely accepted as the only way for Sri Lanka to recover from the economic crisis. However, unfortunately, you asked about reforms. We're not seeing any reforms. The reform program, again, that was started by the former president, which would have seen as many as 75 state-owned enterprises in the country either restructured, privatized, or in some cases shut down, has been completely shelved. We'll take, for example, I'll just name three. CEB, which was unbundled during our time, the idea behind it was to unbundle CEB into several smaller companies that would allow for private investment into the energy sector. Unfortunately, now the government has announced that while the unbundling is happening, it's still going to remain 100% state-owned. So really nothing has changed there. CPC, the fuel distribution of the country, was liberalized, again with private sector players coming into the market to increase competitiveness and thereby reduce the cost of the fuel. Unfortunately, again, in this year, we've seen one of the proposed players who had agreed to come in, United Petroleum, withdraw because of a lack of confidence in the government. And then, of course, the big one, Sri Lankan Airlines. Last year, over 7 billion rupees in profit. This year, a loss of 2 billion rupees. On top of that, a 20 billion rupee infusement by the government to keep the airline afloat. Now, Sri Lankan Airlines is a problem that this government has inherited. However, the government and members of the NPP need to raise their hand and take responsibility for the continued stuttering of the reforms to Sri Lankan Airlines. Since 2015, when the UNP has been in power, successive attempts have been made to privatize the airline. Unfortunately, every time that has happened, members of the now ruling party used to take to the streets with their unions and opposed it. I saw on Friday now the president said that it is a massive problem, nobody wants to touch it, and they're going to look at alternatives. I'm curious to know what these alternatives are. But honestly, with this budget, we're not seeing any reforms going forward. And that is a concern for us because come 2026, December, the IMF program ends. So where do we go from there? So certainly this budget will help us limp along through the next year, but it's going beyond that. There's very little reason to be hopeful. And we also have to remember that, yes, the president inherited an economy that had been ravaged by bankruptcy. Unfortunately, they have not given credit to the former president that he handed over an economy that had been stabilized. And the stage was set to continue the IMF program and go further with the reform program, where then by 2028, when we will start to repay the debt, we'd be in a strong position to do so while continuing economic growth.